London fog lay thick upon the city that autumn evening. At 221 B. Baker Street, Holmes sat idle, craving challenge. Then came the urgent knock at the door. A prominent engineer, Mr. Elias Hawthorne, found dead beneath London Bridge. Hanged from a rusted chain, body swaying in the Thames breeze. Scotland Yard deemed it suicide, driven by financial despair. But Holmes saw a link, the chain's peculiar markings not matching any bridge ironwork. One link in a chain that would bind a killer. The game is afoot. Chapter 1. The first link, John H. Watson, M.D., set down these events as they occurred in the autumn of 1892, when the fogs of London lay especially thick and choking upon the city. It was a bitter evening. The damp mist seeped through every crack at 221 B. Baker Street, bringing with it the sharp smell of coal smoke from 100 chimneys, and the faint, briny tang of the distant Thames. Holmes reclined in his favourite armchair beside the coal fire, which crackled and popped, sending warm orange light dancing across the chemical apparatus scattered on the deal table. The air carried the rich, pungent scent of his strong tobacco from the Persian slipper on the mantel, and I tasted the bitter edge of black coffee as I sipped from my cup, the porcelain warm against my palms, while the damp newspaper in my lap felt clammy and cold. A sudden sharp rap sounded at the street door below, followed by the familiar creak of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps ascending the 17 stairs. She entered first, cheeks flushed from the chill, and announced Inspector Lestrade with a slight nod. The inspector followed, to removing his bowler hat to reveal hair glistening with fog droplets. His rough tweed coat still carried the outdoor cold, and I caught the faint odour of Thames mud clinging to the leather of his boots as he shook my hand. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes," he began, voice carrying that familiar brisk tone, "I have a matter that may interest you, though I confess it appears quite straightforward." Holmes's grey eyes gleamed with that peculiar inner light as he motioned Lestrade to the fireside chair. The warmth of the hearth contrasted sharply with the inspector's chilled presence. "Straightforward, yet you brave this fog to reach Baker Street," Holmes observed dryly. Lestrade produced a telegram, its paper crisp despite the damp night, and the sound of rain began tapping insistently against the window panes like impatient fingers. I could smell the ink and the trace of coal smoke from the messenger boy's hands. "A gentleman was found dead this morning beneath London Bridge," Lestrade continued, words punctuated by the distant solemn toll of Big Ben. "Mr. Elias Hawthorne, a respected civil engineer lately engaged in strengthening the bridge structure. He was discovered hanging from a heavy chain looped over one of the lower crossbeams. A suicide note in his pocket speaking of overwhelming debts." The inspector warmed his hands at the fire. A draught whistled through the sash, shifting the room's temperature momentarily. Holmes steepled his long fingers beneath his chin, the smooth curve of his unlit pipe resting on the chair arm. We set out at once in a hansom cab, and the wheels clattered loudly over wet cobblestones that felt treacherously slick beneath our feet when we alighted near the bridge approach. Fog horns moaned low and mournful across the black river, their sound vibrating through the thick mist that clung coldly to my face and beard like wet silk. The overpowering stench of Thames mud rose here, mingled with the metallic bite of rust from the bridge ironwork, and I tasted salt spray on my lips carried by the river breeze. Gas lamps burned with feeble yellow halos, their light reflected waveringly on the dark water below. The body itself had already been conveyed to the morgue, but the chain still hung, swaying slightly, its links rough and pitted under my cautious touch. Footsteps echoed on the narrow stone stairs, descending to the water's edge, where a uniformed constable stood with his lantern, the warm glow pushing back against the bitter cold. Holmes knelt, coat brushing the damp ground, and examined the dangling chain with his lens. "Observe closely, Watson," he murmured, voice clear despite the enveloping fog. "This alloy is anomalous, not the ordinary wrought iron used throughout the bridge." Here was the first link, the chain's unusual composition, showing flecks of a rarer ore not native to standard London manufacture. Such a mixture is produced only in a handful of specialized Birmingham foundries that supply maritime and industrial chains. I remembered a parallel in the singular affair of the Gloria Scott, as where a vessel's anchor chain carried unique hammer marks and alloy traces that eventually chained a long-ago mutiny back to its Australian perpetrators. The metal itself bore witness to blows struck years before. Secrets the guilty believed safely submerged. Thus, this chain could not have come from the bridge. It was brought here deliberately. Murder disguised as suicide. The link forges strong, Watson. Did you see it form before Holmes pointed it out? Lestrade gave a short, sceptical huff, breath clouding in the chill air, but Holmes pressed on, indicating fresh scuff marks on the beam overhead, textured like leather, dragged violently across iron. A second link. These abrasions are inconsistent with a body simply dropping into place. The logical forge. They speak of struggle, of hands or ropes gripping and pulling against resistance, not the limp descent of a suicide. In the Musgrave ritual, similar scratches upon oak flooring chained a hidden treasure to the movements of desperate men. The ground remembers every frantic step. Here, the beam remembers resistance. Hawthorne was overpowered before the noose was placed. What chain would you build from these two observations, dear reader? We took another cab to the morgue. The vehicle's interior smelled of old leather and faint horse sweat. The wheels rumbled steadily over uneven cobbles. Inside the cold chamber, the air struck like a physical blow, sharp carbolic soap dominating every breath, the smooth marble slab gleaming under gaslight. Holmes drew back the sheet with steady hands. His fingers traced the deep bruises encircling the neck, their texture rougher and broader than the chain's own links would produce. Our footsteps rang hollowly in the empty room. I tasted bile rising at the sight. "A third link," Holmes announced quietly. "Petechiae in the eyes and burst vessels in the face, yet the ligature mark does not match the chain's width or pattern. The forge. Manual strangulation occurred first, pressure sufficient to rupture small vessels before the body was suspended. This recalls the speckled band, where a subtle mark from a trained snake concealed the true mechanism of death. The discrepancy alone chained premeditation to the crime. Therefore, murder is certain, staged with care. Watson missed it initially. Did you spot the mismatch, listener? Back at Baker Street by evening, the fire had been built up high, its crackle banishing the morgue's lingering chill. I sipped hot tea laced with a touch of sweet brandy, its steam curling upward like the fog outside, while Holmes paced rapidly before the hearth, pipe clenched between his teeth. The rich tobacco aroma filled the room, mingling with a faint whiff of gunpowder from his afternoon experiments. We reviewed the suspects. Business partner Reginald Thorpe, poised to benefit from insurance money. The grieving yet oddly composed widow Amelia Hawthorne. Rival engineer Victor Langford. Dismissed labourer Tom Briggs. The foreign gentleman Herr Klaus Möller, last seen quarrelling with the deceased. and the young nephew Arthur, sole heir. Holmes drew thoughtfully on his pipe, eyes distant. Reflecting aloud, he likened the day's discoveries to the opening threads of a study in scarlet, where seemingly unconnected details, boot prints in garden soil, a word scrawled in blood, but the odour of poison, gradually forged an unbreakable chain leading to Jefferson Hope and his righteous vengeance. No crime stands alone. Each is bound by logic's forge to its maker. Here, too, the chain, the scuffs, the bruises, each link waits only connection. Holmes's powers never cease to astonish me. Looking back, I should have seen more. The fog pressed damply against the panes, and I felt the worn leather of my chair beneath my hands. Holmes reached for his Stradivarius and plucked a few soft, thoughtful notes that hummed in the warm air. The first link forged. The chain begins. Chapter 2. Forging Connections. The following morning dawned grey and heavy with fog, the kind that muffles every sound and turns London into a city of ghosts. I rose early, drawn by the crackle of the coal fire Mrs. I. Hudson had already kindled in our sitting room. The warmth fought valiantly against the bitter chill that pressed through the window frames, carrying the ever-present smell of damp coal smoke and the faint sour tang of the river that never quite leaves the air at this season. Holmes stood by the window, silhouetted against the pale light, drawing thoughtfully upon his pipe. The rich, dark tobacco scent filled the room and blended with the bitter steam rising from my morning coffee. The newspaper on the table felt damp to the touch, its headlines still proclaiming Hawthorne's death, a tragic suicide. A telegram arrived with the post, delivered by a boy whose coat reeked of wet wool and street mud. Holmes tore it open, read it in a single glance, and announced, "Lestrade requests our presence at Hawthorne's offices in Cannon Street. He has discovered the ledgers." His eyes held that peculiar gleam once more. We descended the 17 steps, hailed a hansom, and rattled off through the fog-bound streets, the cab's wheels clattering over slick cobblestones that rang hollow beneath iron rims. The leather seats were cold and cracked under my palms. Outside, foghorns groaned mournfully from the direction of the Thames. Hawthorne's offices occupied the second floor of a narrow building near the river. We climbed the dark stairs, our footsteps echoing on worn wood, and were admitted by Mr. Reginald Thorpe himself, Hawthorne's business partner. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, dressed in good but slightly worn tweed, the fabric rough against the smooth mahogany of the desk as he rose to greet us, and the room smelled strongly of fresh carbolic soap and old ledgers. A small coal fire burned in the grate, throwing welcome heat against the damp that seeped from the walls. "Gentlemen," Thorpe said in a deep resonant voice that carried like footsteps on stone stairs, "this is a dreadful business. Elias was in financial difficulties, debts mounting for months. The note he left makes it clear." He gestured toward a ledger open on the desk. Holmes bent over it at once, his long fingers tracing columns of figures. After a moment, he straightened. "This entry here," he said quietly, tapping a line dated 3 weeks previous. "The ink is still faintly glossy, too fresh for the date claimed." Thorpe blinked, then gave a short laugh that did not reach his eyes. "Surely you do not suggest forgery, Mr. Holmes?" "I suggest nothing yet," Holmes replied. Merely observation. The ink remembers when it was laid down." I felt the first tentative connection forming in my mind, the partner who stood to gain most from insurance money. Did you catch that link before Holmes spoke, reader? We left Cannon Street and took another hansom to the Hawthorns' residence in Mayfair. The journey was slow, the fog thickened as we moved west, and the cabman's horn sounded sharp and lonely. The house was handsome, 3 stories of pale brick with tall windows. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of tobacco smoke from the late engineer's study, and the damp that fog always brings. Mrs. Amelia Hawthorne received us in the drawing-room, a tall, elegant woman in black silk, whose smooth fabric whispered as she moved to the fireside. The coal fire burned brightly here, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold marble hearth, and I accepted a cup of tea whose steam carried a faint sweetness of brandy. "My husband had been troubled," she said, voice low and controlled, though her fingers tightened on the delicate porcelain. "Debts, yes, but he would never have taken his own life." Holmes wandered to the grate and bent to examine the ashes. With tongs he lifted a small fragment of charred paper. "This remnant, madam, Shadow Bridge. What significance does it hold?" She paled visibly. "I know nothing of it. Perhaps some business note." Her denial was swift, yet the tremble in her voice was unmistakable. Another link, fragile, perhaps, but present. "What chain might you begin to forge here, dear listener?" Our next call was to Victor Langford's engineering workshop in Whitechapel. The fog was densest here, heavy with coal smoke and the sharp bite of hot iron from nearby forges. We entered a cavernous shed where bellows roared and hammers rang like distant thunder. The air was hot and dry, a blessed change from the outer chill. Sweat prickled on my brow almost at once. Langford was a stocky man, with calloused hands and a voice rough as grinding stone. "Hawthorne stole contracts from under me," he growled, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag. "Ruined my reputation, but I didn't kill him." Holmes examined a coil of chain hanging from a beam, identical in thickness and dull sheen to the one at the bridge. He lifted a link and showed Langford the small forge mark stamped into the metal. "This mark matches the chain from which Hawthorne was suspended." Langford's face darkened. "I sell chains to half the docks in London. It proves nothing." Yet the coincidence was too neat. Links were multiplying now, Watson. Did you see how they began to align? By late afternoon we reached the docks where Tom Briggs, the dismissed labourer, worked unloading barges. The smell of Thames mud was overpowering, thick and rotten, mingling with tar and wet rope. The cold wind bit through my coat. Foghorns sounded continually, low and mournful. Briggs was a wiry fellow with a bitter face and a voice slurred from cheap ale that still lingered on his breath. "Hawthorne sacked me without cause," he muttered. "Said I was careless. I'd have liked to settle the score, but hanging a man? Not my way." Holmes searched the man's coat pockets with permission and drew out a crumpled receipt for a length of heavy chain purchased 2 days before the death. Briggs stared at it as though it were a snake. "I bought it for the barge. Repairs," he insisted. "Yet the alloy is the same," Holmes murmured. Another thread, another possible connection. The chain was growing, link by careful link. As evening fell, we returned to Baker Street. The fire had been tended. Its steady crackle welcomed us back from the cold. Holmes paced before the hearth, a violin in hand, plucking a few soft, restless notes. I sat with a glass of brandy, the sweet warmth spreading through me while the fog pressed damply against the windows. We had visited 4 distinct places, spoken with 4 very different voices, and each had yielded something. A forged entry, a torn note, a matching chain mark, a suspicious receipt, Holmes paused, pipe between his teeth. "The links are forging, Watson. Scattered at first, but now they begin to take shape." I nodded, feeling the weight of the day settle upon me. The connections were there, half visible, waiting for the final heat of reason to bind them fast. Links forging. The chain takes shape. Chapter 3. The chain grows. Looking back upon that third morning of the investigation, I am struck by how rapidly the scattered observations began to interlock, much as the great iron spans of London Bridge itself are joined link by link into an unbreakable whole. The fog had not lifted. If anything, it lay thicker over the city, a grey veil that carried the ever-present smell of coal smoke and the damp, earthy reek of the river. At 221 B Baker Street, the coal fire burned steadily, its crackle a comforting counterpoint to the muffled sounds of the street below. Holmes stood before the mantel, drawing upon his pipe with slow, deliberate pulls. The rich tobacco aroma filled the room and mingled with the steam rising from my cup of hot tea, which tasted faintly sweet from the brandy Mrs. Hudson had added against the morning chill. A note from Lestrade arrived by messenger boy, its paper already curling at the edges from the damp. "Return to the scene beneath the bridge," Holmes read aloud. "Constable reports something overlooked in the mud." His eyes gleamed with that peculiar inner light. We descended the 17 steps, hailed a hansom, and rattled eastward once more. The cab's wheels clattered over wet cobblestones. The leather seats felt cold and stiff beneath us, and outside the foghorns moaned low and continuous, their sound vibrating through the mist like a warning. We descended the narrow stone stairs to the river's edge, our footsteps echoing hollowly against the damp walls. The tide was out. The exposed mud reeked powerfully of rot and salt, thick enough to coat the tongue. Gas lamps burned feebly along the embankment, their yellow halos swallowed almost at once by the fog. The chain still hung from the crossbeam above, swaying very slightly in the river breeze, its rough links glinting dully. Holmes knelt at once beside the footprint we had noted only cursorily on the first day, deep, with a pronounced heel and a distinctive pattern of nail-heads worn unevenly into the sole. "The link," he said quietly, tracing the impression with a gloved finger. "This left boot shows greater wear on the outer edge, indicating a pronounced limp of long standing." He rose and moved a few paces along the muddy bank until he found a second, shallower print, half submerged. Here again, the same uneven drag. The logical forge followed swiftly. Such a limp is not easily concealed, and the depth of the impressions shows weight borne forward, as though the man carried something heavy, perhaps a struggling victim, before setting the body to hang. I recalled instantly the affair of the Boscombe Valley mystery, where a single line of boot prints with a characteristic drag across wet grass chained a son to innocence and a father to a hidden crime of passion. The ground, as Holmes so often said, remembers every uneven step. Here the Thames mud had preserved the truth the murderer believed washed away, but therefore the assailant walked with a limp and was present at the moment of death. The bind is clear, dear reader. Did you forge this link before Holmes named it? Further along the bank, caught on a jagged piece of iron protruding from the masonry, Holmes discovered a few fine threads of silk, dyed a deep indigo. He held them to the feeble gaslight. Another link. Silk of this quality and colour is not the stuff of dock labourers or engineers in workaday clothes. The forge. Such fabric belongs to expensive scarves or cravats worn by gentlemen of means, or perhaps by a foreign visitor accustomed to finer things. The threads were fresh, not frayed by long exposure, They had snagged only hours before the body was discovered. Holmes tucked them carefully into an envelope. These fibres connect directly to the upper classes, or to one who moves among them. What chain would you build now, listener, from silk in the mud and a limping footprint? We searched further. Beneath a loose stone near the waterline, Holmes dislodged a small scrap of paper, sodden but legible. The ink had run slightly, yet the words remained. Shadow falls at midnight. The handwriting was hurried, the paper of good quality, textured faintly like banknote stock. The rain began again, soft pattering drops that mingled with the lapping of the river against the piers. I tasted salt spray on my lips as the wind freshened. Holmes stood motionless for several seconds, eyes narrowed. Then the major deductive leap came. "Consider, Watson, the silk threads match the description of a scarf Mrs. E. Amelia Hawthorne was seen wearing only 2 days before her husband's death. Indigo, monogrammed in silver. The limp corresponds precisely to Reginald Thorpe's old wound from the Afghan campaign, which he takes care to conceal with a stiff gait, but cannot entirely hide. The note, shadow falls at midnight, echoes phrasing used by Herr Meller in a letter found among Hawthorne's papers, a letter intercepted by the widow herself. He turned to me, pipe clenched between his teeth. 3 separate strands, silk, limp, cryptic warning, now converge upon the same narrow circle of suspects. The chain grows, link by careful link. We returned to Baker Street as the afternoon darkened early. The fire had been built up. Its warmth drove back the chill that clung to our coats. Holmes paced before the hearth, was occasionally plucking a single vibrating note from the strings of his Stradivarius. I sat with a measure of brandy, its sweet burn steadying me after the raw river air. The room smelled of tobacco, warm leather from our chairs, and the faint carbolic trace that always lingered after Holmes's chemical experiments. In the quiet that followed, Holmes spoke reflectively of an earlier case. "Do you recall the Hound of the Baskervilles, Watson? There, too, the moor preserved its secrets in footprints, human prints beside those of a monstrous hound, legends of spectral beasts woven deliberately to mask a very human greed. The chain was long, phosphorescent paint on a dog, a missing boot, an ancient curse, a hidden heir, all forged together by patient observation until superstition crumbled before logic. Here, likewise, the shadows of London Bridge conceal no supernatural agency, only human calculation. The footprints, the silk, the note, each a link waiting to be heated in the forge of reason." I nodded, marvelling once again at the clarity with which he saw connections invisible to others. The fog pressed damply against the window panes. Big Ben told the hour somewhere in the muffled distance. The evidence was no longer scattered. It had begun to cohere into something solid, something unbreakable. The chain grows stronger, logic binds. Chapter 4. Testing the Links. The 4th day of our inquiry dawned with a thin, pale sunlight, struggling through the persistent fog, which had thinned enough to reveal the outlines of chimneys and rooftops, but still carried the familiar bite of coal smoke and damp stone. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire roared steadily, its warmth a welcome contrast to the chill that clung to the window panes. Holmes stood before the hearth, steepled fingers resting against his lips, the smooth bowl of his pipe cold for once, as he reviewed the growing chain in silence. I sipped bitter coffee, its sharp taste steadying me, while the newspaper on the table bore damp creases and the faint smell of printer's ink. "Today, Watson," Holmes announced at last. "We test each link. Weak ones will shatter under pressure. The true chain will hold." His voice was calm, yet I recognized the quiet energy that always preceded decisive action. We set out in a hansom cab, the wheels clattering briskly over drying cobblestones, the leather seats cool against my back. Our first test was at Reginald Thorpe's club in Pall Mall, and the establishment smelled of polished leather, cigar smoke, and the warm wax of beeswax candles. Thorpe sat in a deep armchair near the fire, a glass of brandy in hand. Holmes approached without preamble. "Mr. Thorpe, you stated you were here until past midnight on the night in question. Yet your pocket watch. May I see it?" Thorpe hesitated, then drew it out. Holmes examined the face. "It is stopped at 11:14. The hands have not moved since." Thorpe flushed. "I forgot to wind it. A trifling matter." "Trifling indeed," Holmes replied, "but it breaks your alibi cleanly. The club porter confirms you left at 10:45. The link of the club alibi snapped like brittle iron. Thorpe's face darkened. He said nothing more. "Did you spot that small mechanical betrayal before Holmes named it, reader?" We moved next to Mrs. Amelia Hawthorne's Mayfair drawing-room. The air was scented with sweet brandy from a decanter and the faint perfume of dried lavender. She received us stiffly, silk dress rustling smoothly as she gestured to seats by the fire. Holmes produced the charred fragment from her grate. "This paper, shadow over the bridge, you denied knowledge. Yet the handwriting matches a note in your own hand, found among your husband's effects." She paled, fingers tightening on the arm of her chair. "It was a private matter. A warning I received, nothing more." "A warning you burned," Holmes observed. "Yet you left the house at 11, telling your maid you were visiting friends. The friends confirm you never arrived. The red herring of a jealous wife, so plausible at first glance, crumbled under scrutiny. Another weak link shattered. Well, what would you have deduced from the half-burned words, listener?" Our third test took us to Victor Langford's Whitechapel workshop. Heat from the forge blasted us as we entered. The air smelled of hot iron, coal dust, and sweat. Hammers clanged rhythmically. Langford wiped his hands on a rag and faced us defiantly. "The chain you showed me yesterday. I sell dozens like it. It proves nothing." Holmes drew the receipt from his pocket, the one we had seen among Briggs's belongings, and laid it beside a ledger on the workbench. "This purchase order for chain, dated the day before the murder, bears your signature. Yet the ink is still tacky in places, applied within the last 48 hours. Langford's jaw tightened. "I reordered records for my books. A clerical error." "An error that forges a false trail," Holmes said quietly. "You attempted to place the chain in another's hands after the fact." The link of the rival engineer broke cleanly. Langford turned away, breathing hard. At the docks we tested Tom Briggs. The Thames mud smell was sharp in the cold wind. Foghorns sounded distantly. Briggs stood on a barge, coiling rope whose rough fibres rasped against his palms. "You purchased chain," Holmes began. "Aye, for barge repairs. Ask the captain." We did. The captain confirmed the purchase and the repairs. 3 independent labourers swore Briggs had been drinking in the dockside tavern from 10 until 2 in the morning. No limp, no indigo silk, no midnight rendezvous. This link held firm, for the moment. Our 5th test was at Herr Klaus Müller's modest hotel near the Strand. The lobby smelled of damp carpet and carbolic. A coal fire sputtered weakly. Müller met us in a small sitting room, his accent thick, his limp pronounced as he crossed the floor. "You argued with Hawthorne days before his death," Holmes said. Business dispute only. Nothing more. Holmes produced a telegram form. This message, sent from Berlin 2 days ago, places you in Germany at the time of the murder. The hotel register and cabman both confirm your arrival here only yesterday. Muller's shoulders sagged. Then I am clear. Completely, Holmes answered. Another suspect link dissolved. Finally, we called upon young Arthur Hawthorne at his college rooms near the British Museum. Footsteps echoed on stone stairs. The air smelled of old books and coal smoke from a small grate. Arthur was pale, earnest, clearly shaken. I loved my uncle, he said simply. I inherit. Yes, but I would never— Holmes examined his boots. No uneven wear, no traces of Thames mud. His movements were swift and sure, no limp. His alibi, a tutorial with a professor, was verified by 3 witnesses. Motive existed, but evidence did not connect. Back at Baker Street by evening, the fire crackled high. Holmes paced before it, occasionally reaching for the Persian slipper to replenish his pipe. The room smelled of strong tobacco and the faint sweetness of my brandy. I felt the texture of the worn leather armchair beneath me as I reviewed the day's work. 5 suspects tested, 4 alibis or connections broken like brittle links under the hammer of fact. Only the chain of physical evidence, the alloy, the silk threads, the limping footprint, the forged entries, remained intact, I pointing inexorably toward one figure who had not yet been fully confronted. Holmes paused, eyes gleaming. Weak links shattered, Watson. The true chain emerges, stronger, narrower, unbreakable. Weak links shattered. The true chain emerges. Chapter 5. The Chain Tightens. The 5th morning broke with a cold, driving rain that turned the fog into a stinging mist and sent rivulets of water racing along the gutters of Baker Street. Inside 221B, the coal fire burned fiercely, its crackle and pop a steady heartbeat against the drumming of rain on the window panes. The room smelled strongly of Holmes's tobacco, rich and dark from the Persian slipper he had just replenished, and of the hot tea Mrs. Hudson had brought up, its steam carrying a faint sweetness of milk and sugar. I stood by the hearth, feeling the warmth on my face while the chill still clung to my dressing gown, tasting the bitter edge of the morning coffee that lingered on my tongue. Holmes had not slept. His eyes held that peculiar bright gleam, sharper than usual, and he paced rapidly before the fire, long legs carrying him from mantel to window and back. The Stradivarius lay silent on the table. Instead, he held a small envelope containing the indigo silk threads and the sodden note fragment. At last he stopped, turned to me, and spoke with quiet intensity. Watson, the chain has narrowed to 2 remaining possibilities, Thorpe and Meller. But Meller's Berlin telegram is ironclad, verified by the German consulate this morning. That leaves Thorpe. Tonight we force the final link into place. We prepared swiftly. Holmes donned his heaviest ulster and pulled the brim of his deerstalker low. I followed suit, feeling the rough tweed scratch against my neck as we descended the 17 steps into the rain-soaked street. A hansom cab waited, summoned by a sharp whistle. Its wheels hissed over wet cobblestones as we rattled toward London Bridge. The leather seats were damp and cold. Outside, gas lamps burned with sickly yellow halos, their light refracted through sheets of rain. Foghorns moaned low across the Black River, and the smell of wet coal smoke mixed with the ever-present reek of Thames mud. We alighted near the bridge approach and descended the familiar stone stairs to the water's edge. The tide was high now. Black water slapped against the piers with a hollow rhythmic sound. Holmes moved silently along the embankment, a lantern shielded under his coat. Then he froze. Ahead, in the shadow of a buttress, a figure limped forward. Broad shoulders, stiff gait, unmistakable even in the rain. Reginald Thorpe. He carried a small valise. His footsteps dragged unevenly on the wet stone. Holmes stepped into the open, voice cutting through the rain like a blade. "Mr. Thorpe, a late hour for a stroll beneath the bridge." Thorpe started, spun, and for a moment his face showed raw panic in the lantern light. Then he straightened, forcing calm. "Mr. Holmes, I came to pay respects. My partner died here." "Respect does not require a valise at 1 in the morning," Holmes replied. "Nor does it explain the indigo silk scarf you wear tonight, the mate to the threads snagged on the beam above us." Thorpe's hand flew to his throat. The scarf was indeed indigo, sodden now, but unmistakable. He took a step backward, directly into the path I had quietly taken along the wall. The chase began. He bolted, limping heavily, boots splashing through shallow puddles. Holmes and I pursued along the narrow embankment path, rain lashing our faces, the cold cobblestones treacherous underfoot. Thorpe ducked beneath a low archway. We followed, footsteps pounding, echoes ringing off damp brick. The smell of wet stone and river mud filled my lungs. My coat grew heavy with water. Ahead, Thorpe stumbled, caught himself against a rusted railing, then darted into a narrow alley that ran parallel to the river. We emerged onto a wider street near the warehouses. Gas lamps flickered. Rain hissed on the hot iron as a late goods train rumbled past on the viaduct above. Thorpe glanced back, saw us closing, and veered toward the dockside steps. Holmes lengthened his stride. I kept pace as best I could, heart hammering. At the head of the steps, Thorpe slipped on wet wood, fell heavily, and the valise burst open. Papers scattered, ledgers, letters, a small bottle of indigo dye. Holmes was upon him in an instant, knee pressing into Thorpe's back. "Enough," Holmes said quietly. "The chain is forged." Thorpe struggled once, then went still. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat as he spoke through clenched teeth. "You have nothing. I have everything," Holmes answered. He reached down and lifted a sodden scarf end from Thorpe's coat. "The link. This silk matches precisely the fibres on the beam, same dye, same weave, Berlin import. You wore it the night you strangled Hawthorne, as they used it to bind him before staging the hanging." Thorpe's breath came in harsh gasps. Holmes continued, voice steady against the rain. "The forge, your limp, old Afghan wound, left the uneven prints preserved in the mud. You carried the body to the chain, dragged it upward. The beam remembers the struggle. The note, 'Shadow falls at midnight,' was your own warning, intercepted by the widow, burned in haste. The chain itself, purchased through your own foundry contacts in Birmingham, alloy never used on the bridge. You forged the ledger entries to suggest suicide, planted the note in his pocket, then returned tonight to remove any remaining trace. I stood beside them, rain streaming down my face, tasting salt and river water. The cold bit deep, yet the fire of revelation warmed me more than any hearth." Holmes looked up at me. "Recall the naval treaty case, Watson. There, too, a single sheet of paper chained international intrigue to a desperate man. The watermark, the creases, the ink, all forged an unbreakable sequence. Here the physical traces, silk, footprint, alloy, dye, bind Thorpe as surely as any treaty-bound nations. The motive was simple. Dissolve the partnership before Hawthorne exposed Thorpe's embezzlement of bridge funds. The insurance would cover the debts. The death would silence the witness." Thorpe gave a low, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "You think you've won." "The chain tightens," Holmes said simply. "No escape now." We bound Thorpe's wrists with his own scarf. Ironic justice, and waited for the police whistle Holmes had arranged. Big Ben tolled two somewhere in the wet darkness. The river lapped steadily below, and the rain eased to a drizzle. The foghorn sounded fainter, as though the night itself drew breath. I looked at Holmes, his face calm in the lantern glow, and felt once more the quiet awe his mind inspired. The scattered clues of 5 days had become an iron chain, each link tested, each connection heated in the forge of reason until nothing could break it. The chain tightens. No escape now. Chapter 6. Links to the past. The rain had ceased by the 6th morning, leaving the streets of London slick and gleaming under a pale, watery sun. At 221. Boo Baker Street, the coal fire had been allowed to burn low during the night. Now Mrs. Hudson coaxed it back to life with fresh fuel, and the room slowly filled with the comforting smell of burning coal, mingled with the lingering sharpness of Holmes's tobacco from the previous evening. I sat at the breakfast table, the hot tea steaming before me, its faint sweetness cutting through the bitter aftertaste of coffee. The newspaper lay open, damp at the edges from last night's moisture, its headlines already shifting from tragic suicide to cautious reports of police inquiries at London Bridge. Holmes entered from his bedroom, coat already on, deerstalker in hand. His face bore the calm satisfaction of a man who has seen the greater part of the puzzle fall into place. "Today, Watson, we turn from the present scene to the past. The chain that binds Thorpe did not begin beneath the bridge. It stretches back years. We go to the record office near Chancery Lane. We took a hansom cab westward. The wheels hissed over still wet cobblestones. The leather seats felt clammy beneath us, and the faint odour of horse and harness leather clung to the interior. The city smelled freshly washed, coal smoke tempered by rain, Thames mud subdued for the moment. Big Ben tolled the hour as we passed Westminster, its deep note vibrating through the crisp air. The record office was a sombre building of grey stone, its corridors echoing with our footsteps on worn flagstones. A clerk in a dusty black coat led us to a long table piled with ledgers and parchment folders. The air here smelled of old paper, mildew, and the faint carbolic used to preserve documents. Holmes worked methodically, fingers tracing columns of faded ink, while I examined bundles of correspondence tied with faded red tape. Within the hour, we uncovered the first clear link to Thorpe's history. In 1887, during the construction of a railway viaduct in Bombay, Reginald Thorpe had been a junior partner in a firm supplying ironwork. A scandal erupted. Shipments of substandard chain and fittings, deliberately passed as sound, collapsed during testing and killed 3 labourers. The official inquiry blamed material fatigue, but a suppressed minority report, now buried in these archives, named Thorpe as the man who falsified test certificates. The firm collapsed. Thorpe returned to England quietly, reinventing himself as an engineer of bridges. Holmes closed one ledger with a soft thud. "Here is the route, Watson." A man once exposed for endangering lives with faulty chains returns to London and builds a career upon iron and steel. When Hawthorne discovered discrepancies in the bridge reinforcement contracts, embezzled funds diverted to cover old debts, Thorpe faced ruin again. And the same flaw: inferior materials sold as sound. The past repeats unless severed. We found letters too. One, dated 18 months earlier, was from a Bombay solicitor to Hawthorne, warning of Thorpe's questionable record in India. Hawthorne had kept it, perhaps intending confrontation. Another, intercepted and never posted, was Thorpe's draft reply, angry, defensive, promising to silence any shadow cast upon my name. The handwriting matched the sodden note fragments from the bridge. Shadow falls at midnight. The motive crystallized. Thorpe had not merely killed to protect his partnership share. He had killed to bury a past that would destroy his reputation and send him to prison. The forged ledger entries suggesting suicide were an echo of the falsified test reports in Bombay, deception by paperwork. The chain itself, a purchase through obscure contacts, was no accident. It was a deliberate symbol, perhaps a taunt to Hawthorne in his final moments. We returned to Baker Street in the late afternoon. The fire had been built up again. Its warmth drove the chill from our bones. Holmes paced before the hearth, occasionally pausing to pluck a single resonant note from the Stradivarius strings. I sat with a glass of brandy, the sweet burn steadying my thoughts as the light outside faded to grey. Holmes spoke reflectively, voice low against the crackle of coals. This case recalls the Valley of Fear, Watson. There, too, a man's past crossed an ocean to claim him. An American secret society, a coded message, a branded body, all forged an unbreakable chain between a Pennsylvania coalfield murder and a Sussex manor. The past was not buried. It waited, patient as rust on iron, until circumstance heated it once more. Here the link is similar. India to London, faulty chain to murder chain, old scandal to new death. Observation defeats deception because the past leaves traces, paper, metal, memory. No man escapes the forge of his own history. I nodded, feeling the weight of the day settle. The room smelled of tobacco, warm leather, and the faint sweetness of brandy. Outside, the gas lamps were being lit one by one, their soft hiss carried through the window. The chain was no longer a thing of scattered clues. Past and present had fused into one continuous length, each link heated and hammered by evidence until separation was impossible. Holmes set the violin aside and stood motionless, gazing into the fire. Thorpe believed the Thames would wash his sins away, as the Indian monsoon once washed the dust from his hands. But the river remembers, Watson, and so does logic. I looked at my friend, marvelling yet again at the quiet certainty with which he traced threads others never saw. The fire popped softly. Somewhere distant, a foghorn sounded, low and mournful. The investigation had moved beyond the bridge, beyond the body, into the deeper currents of a man's life. And there the final connections had been made. Past and present, one unbroken chain. Chapter 7. The Complete Chain. The seventh day arrived clear and sharp, the first true break in the autumn fog that had shrouded London for nearly a week. At 2:21, B. Baker Street, the coal fire burned high and steady, its crackle filling the room with warmth that pushed back the lingering chill of the river nights, and the air carried the rich scent of Holmes's tobacco from the Persian slipper on the mantel, blended with the faint carbolic trace of his chemical apparatus, and the comforting smell of fresh tea Mrs. Hudson had just brought up. I sat near the window, feeling the smooth leather of my armchair beneath my palms, sipping hot tea whose steam rose in lazy curls, while the bitter edge of morning coffee still lingered on my tongue. Holmes had sent telegrams at dawn. By early afternoon, the sitting room held a tense assembly. Inspector Lestrade, standing near the door with his bowler in hand. Mrs. Amelia Hawthorne, pale but composed in black silk. Young Arthur Hawthorne, fidgeting with his cufflinks. Herr Klaus Müller, leaning on his stick, limp pronounced. Victor Langford, arms folded, scowling. And Tom Briggs, uneasy in his rough coat, is smelling faintly of tar and river mud. Reginald Thorpe sat apart in the chair nearest the fire, wrists lightly bound at Holmes's insistence, his broad shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the carpet. Mrs. Hudson withdrew quietly after serving tea. The door clicked shut. Holmes stood before the hearth, tall and calm, hands clasped behind his back. The gasogene on the sideboard hissed softly. Outside, hansom cabs clattered past on Baker Street, wheels rumbling over dry cobblestones for the first time in days. "Gentlemen, madam," Holmes began, voice clear and measured. "The chain is forged. Every link has been tested. Tonight, it binds one man alone." He turned first to the physical evidence, stepping to the deal table where he had laid out the exhibits under the glow of the argand lamp. The first group of links, the chain itself, Hyde's alloy, manganese and nickel traces not used in London Bridge ironwork, was traced to a Birmingham foundry that supplies only one London firm in recent years, Thorpe and Hawthorne Engineers. The purchase receipt, dated 3 days before the murder, bears Thorpe's counter-signature. The chain was never part of the bridge. It was brought to the scene deliberately. Thorpe shifted, but said nothing. Second, the indigo silk threads snagged on the beam. They match precisely the scarf Thorpe wore when we confronted him. Berlin weave, same dye lot, confirmed by the importer's records. He strangled Hawthorne with his bare hands first, then used the scarf to bind the wrists before hoisting the body. The petechia in the eyes and the mismatched ligature mark prove strangulation preceded hanging. Mrs. Hawthorne gave a small, stifled sound. Arthur reached for her hand. Third link, the footprint in the Thames mud. Uneven wear on the left sole, deeper heel impression from weight borne forward, the exact pattern of Thorpe's old Afghan limp. The mud preserved it. The tide did not erase it in time. Lestrade nodded slowly, arms crossed. Holmes moved to the timeline. The sequence is unbroken. At 10:30 on the night of the murder, Thorpe left his club. His watch stopped at 11:14 because he forgot to wind it in haste. By 11:40, he met Hawthorne on the bridge approach, as arranged by the intercepted note. Shadow falls at midnight. Strangulation occurred shortly after. The body was suspended by 11:55. Thorpe returned home by 1, using the fog as cover, with the forged ledger entry suggesting suicide was added that same night. Ink still tacky when we examined it. Thorpe's jaw tightened. A muscle worked in his cheek. Witness links follow. Mrs. Hawthorne saw the note fragment and burned it in panic, fearing scandal. Herr Müller's argument with the deceased was over unpaid invoices, nothing more. His Berlin telegram clears him. Langford attempted to forge a receipt after the fact to shift blame. Briggs's purchase was legitimate. His alibi holds. Arthur's inheritance motive exists but lacks any connecting evidence. No mud, no silk, no limp. Muller inclined his head slightly. Langford exhaled through his nose. Motive links complete the circle. In Bombay, 1887, Thorpe falsified chain test reports, causing a collapse that killed 3 men. The scandal was hushed. He fled to England. A Hawthorne discovered the embezzlement of bridge funds. Money diverted to silence old creditors who had traced him. Exposure meant ruin. Prison, disgrace. Murder silenced the only man who knew the full truth. Thorpe lifted his head at last, voice hoarse. "You have no direct witness." "I need none," Holmes answered. "The final connecting link is here." He lifted a small glass vial from the table. Gunpowder residue, distinctive traces of potassium nitrate and charcoal, found on Thorpe's right hand when we took him. He used a blank pistol to force Hawthorne to the beam before the strangling began. The discharge left microscopic particles. The pistol was in the valise he carried to the bridge that night to remove any remaining evidence. A long silence fell. The fire crackled. Big Ben tolled the quarter hour somewhere in the distance. Thorpe's shoulders slumped. He spoke without looking up. I never meant the collapse in Bombay was an accident. Hawthorne would have ruined me. I only wanted to stop him talking. Lestrade stepped forward. Reginald Thorpe, I arrest you for the murder of Elias Hawthorne. 2 constables entered at Lestrade's signal. Thorpe rose slowly. The handcuffs clicked shut with a soft, final sound. As he was led out, he paused at the door and looked back at Holmes. You see too much, he said quietly. I see only what is there, Holmes replied. The door closed. The room seemed suddenly larger, quieter. Mrs. Hawthorne rose, tears in her eyes, but voice steady. Thank you, Mr. Holmes, for the truth. Arthur stood beside her, nodding wordlessly. Langford muttered something about justice at last. Muller touched his hat in silent farewell. Our brig shuffled out last, relieved. When only Lestrade, Holmes and I remained, the inspector cleared his throat. A clean chain, Mr. Holmes. Every link accounted for. Holmes inclined his head. The chain is complete. I looked at my friend, standing motionless before the fire. The peculiar light in his eyes now softened to quiet satisfaction. The room smelled of tobacco, warm coals, and the faint sweetness of untouched tea. Outside, the gas lamps flared one by one along Baker Street. The city moved on, unaware of the justice forged within these walls. Every link accounted for. The chain complete. Chapter 8. Justice in Chains. The morning after the gathering at Baker Street dawned crisp and unusually bright for late autumn. The fog had finally retreated, leaving the sky a pale, washed blue and the streets of London gleaming with the residue of last night's rain. At 221B, the coal fire had been allowed to burn down to embers overnight. Mrs. Hudson rekindled it early, and by the time I descended to the sitting room, the air carried the fresh, smoky warmth of new coal, mingling with the faint, lingering sweetness of yesterday's brandy. Holmes stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the traffic below. Hansom cabs clattering briskly over dry cobblestones for the first time in days. The room smelled of tobacco from his pipe and the clean polish on the furniture. I tasted the bitter edge of strong coffee as I poured a cup, feeling the smooth porcelain warm my palms. A sharp knock sounded at the street door. Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Lestrade, who entered briskly, bowler in hand, his rough tweed coat still carrying the outdoor chill. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. "The warrant is signed. We take Thorpe this morning. He spent the night in the cells at Bow Street, restless but silent. I thought you might wish to be present at the formalities." Holmes inclined his head. "I shall accompany you, Inspector. There are loose ends yet to be tied." We set out in 2 hansoms, Lestrade and a sergeant in one, Holmes and I in the other. The wheels rumbled steadily along Baker Street, then turned toward the Strand and the familiar grim facade of Bow Street Police Court. The air outside smelled of coal smoke, tempered by the fresh wind off the river. Gas lamps still burned faintly in the shadows of narrow alleys despite the daylight. Inside the station the atmosphere was colder, stone floors echoing our footsteps. The sharp scent of carbolic soap and old ink dominating every breath. A constable led us down a short corridor to the holding cells. Reginald Thorpe sat on a narrow bench behind iron bars, coatless, shirt collar open, wrists still bearing the faint red marks of last night's cuffs. His broad shoulders seemed narrower in the dim light. The fire that had driven him to murder had burned low, leaving only ash. He looked up as we approached, eyes meeting Holmes's without flinching. "You've come to gloat," he said quietly. "I have come to see justice done," Holmes replied, "and to close the final links." Lestrade stepped forward with the warrant, reading the charge in a flat, official tone: murder of Elias Hawthorne by strangulation and subsequent staging of suicide. Thorpe listened without interruption. When Lestrade finished, he asked the formal question, "Have you anything to say?" Thorpe drew a long breath. "I killed him. The rest you already know." His voice cracked once, then steadied. "It began in Bombay, 3 men dead because I signed false reports. Hawthorne found the old files. He would have exposed me. I could not let that happen." He looked directly at Holmes. "You were right about the scarf. I wore it that night, habit nothing more. When he struggled, I used it. Then the chain. I thought the river would take the rest." A long silence followed. The cell smelled of damp stone and faint gunpowder residue from some earlier prisoner. Footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond. A distant door clanged shut. Lestrade nodded to the sergeant. "Bring him up for the magistrate." As Thorpe was led away in handcuffs, the iron links clinking softly with each step, he paused once more. "You see everything, Holmes, but you cannot undo what is done." "I do not seek to undo," Holmes answered, "only to prevent further harm." We followed the small procession to the magistrate's court, a short walk through echoing passages. The courtroom was sparsely filled. Reporters scribbling, a few curious onlookers, the clerk arranging papers with brisk efficiency. The magistrate, a stern man with pince-nez glasses, listened as Lestrade presented the charge and the principal evidence. The chain alloy, the silk threads, the footprint, the gunpowder residue, the forged ledger, the Bombay records. Thorpe stood in the dock, head bowed, offering no defence, and the magistrate committed him for trial at the Old Bailey. "Remanded in custody," he said, tapping his gavel once. The sound rang sharp in the quiet room. Outside, in the corridor, Lestrade turned to Holmes. "A clean case, sir. No loose ends left dangling. The widow's statement this morning confirmed she burned the note out of fear for her husband's reputation, nothing more. Young Arthur is cleared entirely. The inheritance is his without stain. Langford's little forgery attempt was just panic. He's been cautioned but not charged. Briggs and Muller were never truly in the frame." Holmes nodded. The chain held because every link was forged in truth. The red herrings, jealousy, rivalry, foreign intrigue, were deliberate or accidental distractions, but they crumbled under weight. We stepped out into the street. The sun had climbed higher, and gas lamps were extinguished, and the city moved with its usual brisk rhythm. Hansom bells, street cries, the distant toll of Big Ben. The air felt lighter, the Thames mud smell fainter on the breeze. Back at Baker Street by early evening, the fire had been built up again. Holmes sat in his armchair, pipe in hand, drawing slow clouds of tobacco smoke that curled toward the ceiling. I poured brandy, sweet on the tongue, and we sat in companionable silence for a time. "The criminal is bound," Holmes said at last, voice low. "Justice, in its slow and certain way, is served." I looked at my friend, the peculiar light in his eyes now softened to quiet reflection. Outside, the gas lamps flared once more along Baker Street. The fog would return tomorrow, no doubt, but for tonight the city seemed clearer, the shadows shorter. The criminal bound, or justice served. Chapter 9. Links restored. The weeks following Reginald Thorpe's committal passed with the slow, inexorable rhythm of English justice. Winter had settled fully upon London. The fog returned in thick, choking banks, but now it carried a different quality, no longer oppressive with mystery, but merely the familiar damp of the season. At 221 B. Baker Street, the coal fire burned day and night, its steady crackle a constant against the muffled sounds of the city outside. The room smelled richly of Holmes's tobacco from the Persian slipper, mingled with the clean scent of fresh newsprint and the faint sweetness of brandy that Mrs. Hudson had taken to leaving on the sideboard. I sat by the hearth one afternoon, feeling the worn leather of my chair warm beneath me, sipping hot tea whose steam curled upward, while the bitter aftertaste of coffee lingered faintly on my tongue. The Old Bailey trial had concluded that morning. Thorpe pleaded guilty to murder on the second day, sparing the court a lengthy spectacle and the Hawthorns further public pain. The judge, taking into account the premeditation but also the absence of prolonged suffering inflicted upon the victim, sentenced him to penal servitude for life. No appeal was lodged. The newspapers carried brief, sober accounts. The sensation had already faded from the front pages, replaced by reports of strikes in the docks and the latest polar expedition. Mrs. Amelia Hawthorne called upon us that same afternoon. She arrived in a closed carriage, stepping lightly up the 17 stairs despite the weight of recent grief. Her black mourning dress was of fine silk, smooth under her gloved fingers, and she carried herself with quiet dignity. Holmes rose as she entered. I offered her the chair nearest the fire. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, voice steady though low, "I come to thank you. The truth, however painful, has freed us from suspicion and rumour. My husband's name is cleared of the stain of suicide. The insurance will pay, and the bridge works continue under new management. Arthur has taken up his studies again without the shadow hanging over him." Holmes inclined his head. "The chain of evidence was forged to reveal truth, madam, not to wound unnecessarily. Your husband deserved justice." She produced a small packet from her reticule, letters neatly tied. These were found among Elias's private papers after the trial, correspondence from Bombay, confirming what you uncovered. He intended to confront Thorpe quietly, to give him a chance to make restitution. He never had the opportunity. Her fingers tightened briefly on the ribbon. I burned the warning note in panic that night. Foolish of me. But now, everything is known. Arthur Hawthorne arrived shortly after, hat in hand, cheeks flushed from the cold wind. He had grown taller, or perhaps straighter in these weeks. "Sir," he said to Holmes, "the estate is settled. I inherit the house in Mayfair and my uncle's share of the firm. I mean to continue his work, properly this time. No more hidden debts, no more shortcuts." Holmes regarded the young man with a rare, faint smile. "Your uncle would approve, I think. The chain of his life ends here. Yours begins anew." We spoke for an hour. Mrs. A. Hawthorne spoke of plans to travel to the continent once morning allowed. Perhaps Florence, where the light was kinder and the past less heavy. Arthur spoke of engineering lectures and a new project to reinforce older London bridges without cutting corners. Their futures, once clouded by accusation and grief, now stretched clear ahead. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Hawthorne paused at the door. "One last thing, Mr. Holmes. The scarf, the indigo one, was burned. I could not bear to keep it. But I have kept the monogrammed handkerchief that matched it. a small reminder that beauty can be twisted to dark purpose. Holmes nodded. A fitting close. When the door closed behind them, the room seemed quieter. Holmes paced once before the fire, then sat opposite me, drawing thoughtfully upon his pipe. The tobacco smoke curled upward, blending with the steam from my cooling tea. "Order returns slowly," he observed. "The innocent are cleared, the guilty bound. London continues." I looked out the window. Gas lamps were being lit along Baker Street, their soft yellow glow piercing the early dusk. Hansom cabs passed below, wheels rumbling over cobbles now free of ice. The foghorns on the Thames sounded distant, almost peaceful. The city had absorbed the tragedy as it absorbed so many, swallowing the shock, closing the wound, moving forward under its own vast momentum. That evening a telegram arrived from Lestrade. "Thorpe transferred to Portland Prison. All files closed. Grateful for your assistance." I read it aloud. Holmes merely nodded, eyes on the fire. The next days brought small confirmations of restoration. A note from Arthur. His first engineering report accepted by the firm. No questions raised about the past. A brief letter from Mrs. Hawthorne in Paris. "The Seine is not the Thames, but it flows all of the same. Thank you again." Even Victor Langford sent a curt card acknowledging that contracts were now fairly bid. Tom Briggs returned to steady work on the docks, his name forgotten in connection with the case. London itself seemed to breathe easier. The bridge stood unchanged, great iron spans bearing the weight of traffic day and night, but the shadow that had fallen across it had lifted. Gaslight flickered on wet pavements. Coal smoke rose from countless chimneys. The river carried on toward the sea. Life resumed its patterns. Clerks hurrying to offices, vendors calling wares, children running through alleys, and the murder beneath London Bridge became one more story, folded into the city's endless chronicle. At Baker Street, Holmes returned to his chemical experiments and violin practice. The Stradivarius sang softly in the evenings, notes floating against the crackle of the fire. I resumed my medical rounds, the journal of this case nearly complete. The chain had done its work, binding the guilty, freeing the innocent, restoring balance. One quiet evening. As snow began to fall softly outside the window, first flakes of the season, I looked across at Holmes, who sat with steepled fingers, gazing into the flames. "The links are restored," I said. He nodded once. "Order restored to London streets." Chapter 10. By the Fire at Baker Street. Several weeks had passed since the Old Bailey pronounced sentence on Reginald Thorpe, and London had folded the affair away, as it does so many dark episodes, into the quiet corners of memory and the brief columns of fading newsprint. Winter had deepened. Snow lay thin on the rooftops and thicker in the side streets, muffling the usual clatter of hansom wheels and turning gaslight into soft, haloed glows. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned with a steady, generous warmth that held the outer chill at bay. The room smelled richly of Holmes's tobacco, dark and fragrant from the Persian slipper he had just refilled, mingled with the clean scent of polished wood, the faint carbolic trace of his chemical bench, and the sweet undertone of brandy poured into 2 glasses on the low table between us. I sat in my usual armchair, legs stretched toward the hearth, feeling the worn leather warm beneath me as I sipped the brandy, its gentle burn spreading pleasantly after the bitter edge of afternoon coffee. Holmes reclined opposite, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in that rare state of complete repose He permitted himself only when a case had been fully resolved. The Stradivarius rested across his knees. Every so often he plucked a single soft note that hummed and died in the warm air. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the window in slow silence. Big Ben told the hour with distant, muffled dignity. The evening papers lay on the side table, headlines already turning to fresher matters. Labour disputes in the Midlands, a new Antarctic expedition, but one small paragraph noted Thorpe's transfer to Portland Prison, and the quiet resumption of bridge reinforcement works under untainted management. Holmes glanced at it once, then set it aside. "Satisfactory close, Watson," he said at last, voice low against the fire's crackle. "The chain held firm from first link to last." I nodded, setting my glass down. "You forged it link by link with a patience I can only admire. The alloy of the chain, the indigo threads, the limping footprint, the gunpowder residue, the Bombay records. Each observation seemed trivial alone, yet together they became unbreakable." Holmes drew upon his pipe, sending a thin blue stream toward the ceiling. "That is the science of deduction, Watson. Not inspiration, but observation sharpened by logic. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. In this case, the impossible was suicide. The mismatched ligature, the fresh ink, the foreign alloy. What remained was murder. Premeditated, staged, rooted in a past the murderer believed safely buried." He paused, eyes distant, as though retracing the entire sequence. "Recall the Glorious Scott, where a ship's chain bore unique markings that chained mutiny to its Australian perpetrators decades later, or the Boscombe Valley footprints that preserved a limp across wet grass, freeing an innocent son while binding a guilty father, or the Naval Treaty, where a single watermark on stolen paper forged espionage to a desperate clerk. In each, the physical trace, the metal, the print, the fibre, defeated deception because the world remembers what men forget. Here the Thames mud remembered the footprint, the beam remembered the struggle, the scarf remembered its owner. No amount of staging could erase those silent witnesses." I leaned forward, yet Thorpe nearly succeeded. The note, and the forged ledger, the staged hanging, all designed to point to despair rather than design. "Precisely," Holmes said. "Deception thrives on distraction. Red herrings of jealousy, rivalry, foreign intrigue. But distraction is fragile. Truth is forged in heat and hammered link by link. The method is simple, yet relentless. Observe minutely, connect logically, test rigorously, conclude only when every link is accounted for. Most men see scattered facts. The trained mind sees the chain already forming." He set the pipe aside and took up the violin, drawing the bow once across the strings in a slow, meditative phrase. "The game is never truly over, Watson. London produces fresh puzzles daily. Shadows beneath bridges, secrets in fog-bound alleys. Oh, but each teaches the same lesson. Observation defeats deception because the material world does not lie. A footprint cannot perjure itself. A thread cannot invent its origin. A chain remembers the forge that shaped it. When men forget that truth, they leave traces. When we remember, we follow them home." I smiled faintly. "You make it sound almost mechanical." "It is mechanical," he replied, "yet infinitely human. The criminal believes himself clever. The detective knows only that no man is clever enough to erase every mark he leaves upon the world. That is why the chain tightens, why justice, slow, imperfect, but certain, eventually binds." The fire popped softly. Snow tapped against the pane like distant fingertips. Holmes set the violin down and lifted his glass in a small, wordless toast. I raised mine in return. To the next chain. Then, to the next, he echoed. We sat in silence after that, watching the flames dance and the snow fall outside. The city beyond our windows moved on, gas lamps flaring along Baker Street, hansom bells ringing faintly, the low moan of a foghorn carried on the wind from the river. Another case concluded, another shadow lifted. Yet the work was never finished. London's endless tapestry of crime and consequence continued to weave itself thread by thread. Until the next chain forges, dear listener, the game continues.